everyone. Welcome to Crushing Classical, redefining a thriving classical music career. On the show today, I have my old friend Amir Elsaffar, a trumpet player who has created a unique career as a trumpet player, composer, and ensemble creator. Amir was born and raised in the Chicago area with an American mother and an Iraqi father, and began to explore the music of his heritage in his teens. After college, he decided he needed to know much more. On the show, Amir tells me how he dove into learning this complex tradition and the journey that ensued to learn it. The craziest part? All of this exploration was happening right after 9/11, likely the most difficult time he could have been traveling and learning about his heritage. Before we begin, a couple of quick things. Drone Tuner, a tuner app I came up with, is now a reality. One day, I was practicing hating that ugly mechanical sounding tone coming out of the machine and wishing for a tuner with a drone that actually sounded like a horn. I contacted a friend who owns the company Embertone, a company that creates virtual instruments. Using the technology he uses for his instruments, Drone Tuner was born. It is now out and it's currently available on iOS for iPhone and iPad. It has all the instruments you'd ever want to tune to. And not only can you tune to the real sound of your own instrument or any instrument you want to tune to, the visual technology in this tuner app is amazing. It has a super fast reaction time and is very similar to the strobe tuners back in the day. People are already in love with this app. You can tune intervals and chords and even with vibrato. Check out our website, dronetunerapp.com, to see video tutorials on how the app works, or check out the videos in the App Store. Get yours today at the iTunes App Store. The link is in the bio. I'd also like to thank Fix Music for being a sponsor of Crushing Classical Podcast. FixMusic.com is your online resource for affordable, high-quality sheet music. Fix also offers unique buying options for individuals, teachers, and schools. Whether you have a large private teaching studio or you run a music program, Fix has a solution for you. Contact them through their website for more information. Fix offers priority and priority express shipping at super affordable rates, meaning they do not pad their shipping rates to make money. If you need sheet music fast, Fix will expedite it to you as inexpensively as possible. Also, remember to use the special discount link in the show notes and get 10% off your order. Let's get started. Welcome, Amir. Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for being on Crushing Classical today. It's so good to have you. And it's been so like the last time that we talked before the last time we talked, which was last week, it was like a really long time ago since the 90s, right? When we were in DePaul together.
Yeah, it had been a couple of decades. It's kind of hard to imagine, but it's
A
true.
couple of decades, I know. So you have this really, ever since we left school, you have created this really amazing career, and I wanted to go into the whole story about how that happened. But before I get into that, just tell me, as a trumpet player, I know you're a trumpet player, and I know that you're a composer, and we'll get into all that. But can you tell me what you're doing right now?
I mean, this very moment,
Like,
like these days on the trumpet.
yeah.
Well, it's funny you ask because I'm doing something I'm playing something I've never played before that I've always loved, which is the Bach cello suites.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
and I just recently got my hands on a really good version of them that are, well, I was starting with treble clef, now I'm reading them in bass clef, which is a good challenge.
Yeah.
uh, B flat trumpet. But yeah, I've listened to this music, especially the Casals recordings, for years and years, and always loved it and thought, oh, I wish I was a cello player. And then my friend who plays oud, who plays in Rivers of Sound Orchestra with me, which we'll get into later,
Uh-huh.
showed up and he was playing them on the oud, and it sounded so beautiful. And then we were reading them together, and I got really inspired. And so now I'm kind of revisiting Bach, but hearing his melodies in a different way, having gone through,
Through your
um,
journey.
yes, yeah,
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, you'll have to share a little bit about that, but
so,
first we
yeah,
should talk about your journey so that people know what the heck we're talking about.
yeah,
But so okay, so we knew each other in Chicago, and I felt like you were sort of in two scenes, like as a trumpet player because you were in civic orchestra and did the classical thing with, DePaul orchestra and everything, but I also knew that you were like you had this other life. You're playing jazz and playing gigs in the city with live bands and stuff. So that's actually, don't you think, I think that's pretty unusual in and of itself, right? I mean, I don't know that many trumpet players who did
Yeah,
that, both things.
yeah, especially at the time, I really felt like I was leading a double life, and I felt like it
Did
was
you?
very difficult to maintain both, especially like a lot of the gigs I was doing with jazz and rhythm and blues and other bands on the Chicago scene were happening at night, and then I had to be fresh at 10 o'clock in the morning at Orchestra Hall,
Yeah.
ready to play in a sectional with Bud Herseth, So, like, really burning the candle on both ends, but also musically sort of being very deeply involved in classical music and playing in orchestra while maintaining and still being able to play in jazz improvised contexts and playing in horn sections and blues bands and stuff like that. So,
Yeah. Did anyone ever say to you, hey, dude, you can't do that? You're not supposed to do that.
nobody, I don't think anyone said so directly. Maybe some of my classical teachers wished I would just focus on orchestral excerpts
Uh-huh.
and solo repertoire. I think that I felt that, but nobody ever told me what I could or couldn't do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then at a certain point you decided to stay purely in the jazz world. Why did you end up going that route?
I think that throughout my process of discovering different kinds of music, I was always interested in making my own songs or compositions or improvisations. I wanted to be on the creative side
Uh-huh.
from the very beginning, and I think that that was always my focus, and even during my DePaul years playing in civic and playing orchestral music, I was, there was generally a sense that, yeah, this is for now, but eventually I need to focus on creating my own music.
Right. Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So once school was over, like DePaul was over, you really you decided to leave Chicago, even though it seemed like you had a lot of opportunities lined up already. So what was going on with that decision?
Um, I think, well, throughout my, New York was always the destination or the goal, like
Okay.
to start playing in the New York jazz scene because every time I visit New York, I was just so blown away by the tremendous level of musicianship and
Hmm.
the kind of, of course, there's a lot of competition, so it can be cutthroat, but it also encourages people to play at the absolute best and highest level. And I felt like New York did, and it still does, have that level of performance and also just creativity and people thinking differently and trying different things and connecting between jazz and other styles of music as well as
Uh-huh.
other disciplines of art, performance art and visual art.
Right. So you just
Uh,
thought maybe it was more broad, like
yeah,
more.
well, what I was experiencing in Chicago at the time was that the scenes were sort of there was um, traditional bebop and hard bop uh, jazz scene, and then there was a lot of free improvisation, avant-garde. But I was looking for something in between that was more structured, but kind of coming up with new types of structures. And I, at the time, felt like Chicago was lacking. There were just a handful of musicians dealing in that way. Today, I think Chicago is actually the musical scenes have become much, much more diverse and broad and very interesting. So, yeah.
Interesting. That's cool. They kind of caught up.
Yeah, or just found its own,
Uh-huh.
it's also a generational thing because at the time when I was in Chicago, I was lucky. I caught some musicians at the very end of their lives and their musical careers, like Barrett Deems, who had played with Louis Armstrong. He was 83 when I started playing in his big band, and Lynn Halliday, who had was a Chicago fixture. He was in his 80s. Um, they've passed on since then, but around them were Von Freeman. There was a scene of really more traditional jazz, and then now I think the new generations are looking forward to finding new modes of expression.
Interesting. So one thing that, when you told me this, I thought was interesting, and I wonder if it's because of the way that you see your career or where you wanted it to go, or if it's a common thing for jazz musicians, but to like seek out that place where you belonged. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you said that you just didn't see yourself in those descriptions in Chicago, so you went on to New York where you felt like there was more of a place, more of a pre-existing place where you could fit in to what you were looking to create. Is that is that inherent in jazz, or is that something that you just have in your personality?
Well, I think part of jazz from the very beginning is about finding your own voice
Okay.
and expressing something that's unique to you as a human being, first of all, and as a musician and improviser, sort of creating one's own vocabulary. That sensibility seems to exist within any improvised music,
Okay.
especially jazz. But sometimes jazz can become very codified, and um, there becomes a right way to play
Uh-huh.
and
Like
type.
classical.
Yeah, it can be very, very similarly limited in a way. It all depends on the musician, but
Hmm.
often, especially with the jazz education and certain, patterns and scales that everybody's supposed to learn in order to be competent and fluent in jazz vocabulary, can end up being limiting because you hear many people playing the same ideas. Um, so it's and it's a funny thing too because you can be working with a vocabulary that's shared with many people, but express yourself uniquely within that. There's all kinds of. It doesn't mean everyone has to create a new revolution in the music.
Uh-huh.
Um, just finding your own mode of expression. But yeah, I think for me, I was constantly on a journey, like seeking after some sound. And before I was really into trumpet, I used to play guitar, and it was the Beatles, and then it was the Rolling Stones, and then Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton and blues. And there was always some particular sound or resonance that I was kind of craving or seeking after, and this kind of kept morphing that whatever that muse or that goal or that point of focus, and then started to come into the form of jazz and different types of jazz, from Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk to Coltrane to Cecil Taylor, um, and sort of more avant-garde, was considered avant-garde at that time, and then eventually into Arabic and specifically Iraqi music.
Yeah. So you've it seemed to me like, when we talked before that you got the idea of exploring at a certain point Iraqi music because your heritage is from Iraq.
Yeah.
And so you found so what happened first? Like you decide that you wanted to explore your heritage first before you started to resonate with the jazz musicians also doing that same thing that you mentioned to me, VJ Iyer and the others that were doing that similar thing with theirs, or did you get the idea from them? Like what was your kind of
Yeah,
tracing that back?
I think there were a few different um, paths that led me to Arabic music. One was my sister Dina, who I still play with. She's a violinist and violist and plays an Iraqi traditional instrument called the joza, which is a spike fiddle.
Uh-huh.
But she had started an Arabic music ensemble when she was 18 and I was 13 at the time. And so I was sort of listening to what they were doing and checking it out, but often lamenting that the trumpet was incapable of playing quarter tones, or so I thought. Um, but I was listening. My first introduction to Arabic music was through my sister, her band called Salam, and then eventually, yeah, she showed me some recordings, in particular of a trumpet player from Egypt named Sami al-Babli, who was playing purely Egyptian music, uninfluenced by jazz or classical trumpet. And I actually went to Egypt in '99 to meet him, and he died just a year after that. So I
Oh
was really
wow.
fortunate to have met him before that. Just had a, like kind of a lesson and dinner, and we had a long night hanging out together. Um, and but that was a really important moment for me. And then, but yeah, it was really when I moved to New York and I saw, yeah, you mentioned through Vijay, through Rudresh Mahantapa, through there was Miguel Zenon was just starting at the time. So people introducing elements of non-Western music into jazz, which has been involved. I mean, jazz has been like that from the very beginning,
Huh.
with African and other influences like throughout, just constantly. Brass bands of New Orleans, and I mean, it's been an open uh, kind of music since for its entire 100 years.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that finding people, contemporary artists that were engaging very directly with other traditions and integrating them successfully, that was really interesting to me. So I found my calling, you could say, or my direction sort of through that part of the New York jazz scene.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. That's really awesome. So at what point did you, well, first tell me, so did you ever live in Iraq as a child? Did you, um, or did you, you were born here, right? In the US?
I was born in Chicago, yeah, Chicago area.
Okay. So how did your parents meet? You told me this earlier,
Yeah,
and I want you to tell
yeah.
the story
Sure.
because it's so
Oh,
cool.
yeah, that's sweet. They met on a boat. There was a sort of a transatlantic cruise. I mean, it was a way of getting from North America to Europe, but it was a New York London cruise. I think it took 2 weeks or so. But they met on this boat, and sparks were flying, and they fell in love, and a couple of years later, were married. So that was in the 1960s. I think they met in '64 and married in '66.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's cool. And then you were born in Chicago, and then you lived
Yeah.
here. You lived
Yeah.
in the US.
Gotten professorships in one, my father at DePaul and my mother at University of Illinois Chicago.
Wow. That's a great story. Tell me about the first time. So you were being exposed a little bit to the music from your sister, and then you went to Egypt, which is really cool that you got to meet that trumpet player. Um, when did you really dive into learning more about it, so that more about the Middle Eastern music, so that you could create it for yourself, like in your own compositions?
Um, it basically, at the very beginning, I thought, okay, I'll just get some idea of the Arabic modes and the rhythms, and
Hmm.
come up with ways to combine them with what I already knew in jazz or the directions I was exploring.
Yeah.
Um, but within a few months of just learning a little bit, I wanted to understand more and to uncover more. So with every answer, another question would emerge, and with every,
Mm.
that answer, another question. So it's constantly sort of, and I was really, in particular, intrigued in with Iraqi maqam music, not only because it's my father's, it's my heritage through my father, but also there was something particular in the music that had this, semi-improvised and semi-composed,
Okay.
but in a way that I had never quite encountered before. So as I started to dig in deeper and understand the vocabulary and the way of making music in the Iraqi maqam method, I just fell in deep, and it was 5 years before I kind of reemerged with my first composition, combining jazz and Iraqi maqam. But I continued studying maqam for another, for about a decade, and I'm still working on it. But at that time, it was like an intensive daily activity of learning new pieces and seeking out professors and musicians and experts, and being immersed.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you spell that, Makam?
Maqam. So the Q is a ka sound, which we don't have in English. So maqam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so
Yeah.
that's a whole style in Iraq. It's like their traditional style of music.
Yeah, so maqam in general refers to a modal tradition that exists all over, from all of the Middle East, really starting from North Africa, so Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, that part, through Egypt, through the Persian Gulf, all of the Levantine areas like Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, and
Okay.
Turkey, uh, Iran, Uzbekistan, all those sort of Central Asian republics that are now republics, but even into Western China. So it's this kind of it's centuries old tradition that's been practiced in all these regions, but every place has kind of a particular way of using maqam. And in Iraq, there's a tradition specifically called Iraqi maqam that's has to do with how these modes, they're microtonal modes, so they have notes kind of in between
Hmm.
the flats and sharps and naturals of Western music. But then they're kind of arranged in these longer compositions.
Okay, cool. This is so interesting. So you described just now that you were diving into your own education, studying with different people. Can you give me a timeline? I'm thinking you're in New York, you're starting to get interested in Iraqi music, and I'm thinking, okay, we were talking about the late 90s, and here we are coming into the early 2000s, and you're thinking about Iraq, and we all know like what was going on historically around that time with the United States and the Iraq War and everything. So, what is the like? Can you start by just telling me, how where the education started when when you're starting to get interested in study and starting to plan some travel? Like, how does that bump up to when things were not really necessarily safe to travel over there?
Yeah, it was just sort of I mean, the timing was very odd, and I still, it's hard for me to quite decipher or understand uh, how and why my personal journey and then the world um, political situation just the way that the timing coincided, because I was really like from the late 90s and early 2000 I was just getting into Arabic music. In
Hmm.
August 2001 I went to an Arabic music retreat where I had a chance to learn from Simon Shaheen, who's really a pioneer of Arabic music in the US, and some other teachers, and was getting very interested in the music and starting to finally understand the sort of theoretical part of it. I joined a band in New York, and we played a house concert on September 10th, um, 2001. And I was elated afterwards. That wow, this is a really lovely kind of musical community and sound. And it was just, it's one of these events where somebody's cooking and there's wine and it's just like this
Yeah.
home, very cozy. And I had just learned about 10 songs by then, but was playing them on the trumpet with traditional instruments. And I was really sort of like, wow, this is an interesting and unexpected path for me to take with the music, and sort of contemplating and reveling in that. And then the next morning, I woke up and turned on, someone called me and said, turn on the TV. And I saw both buildings of the World Trade Center
Uh,
were on fire and had been hit. And it's like, wow, what is going on here? And of course, um, I imagined this must be a terrorist act,
yeah.
and it was. And then the fallout and the response to that, and it just was. Yeah, I mean, I was strangely on this side of it. I mean, I was living in New York, literally a mile. I don't know at the distance. It was less than 3 miles from what's now Ground Zero.
Wow.
Um, so yeah, experiencing it on that side, but then also knowing that there was going to be a response, and then of course Iraq was very quickly targeted as what would be the next well, Afghanistan, then Iraq.
Yeah.
Um, so meanwhile, that was going on, but I was still studying the music and following up on all these, just trying to find whatever recordings and getting into this tradition more and more. Then I won a international trumpet competition, Carmine Caruso competition, uh, in October of 2001. And as soon as I won the $10,000 prize, I booked my ticket to the Middle East. So I started in Morocco and then Tunisia, and I wasn't sure if I could go to Iraq because Iraq was very uh, was still unstable, and there was sanctions, and there was all kinds of issues with going. But I really felt it an imperative that I have to go now because if I don't, I might never have a chance, another
Yeah.
chance. And it was kind of true because it was that was I arrived on March 20th of 2002 to Baghdad, and that was sort of this life-changing moment of discovery and connection to this music and culture. And I spent most of 2002 in Iraq, and I left at the end of that year. And then March 20th of 2003 is when uh, the invasion began and the bombs started dropping. So it was sort of oddly timed. By that point, I was in Jordan and then in Syria, and I was studying related musical traditions there. But yeah,
Okay.
it was a tense period to be.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know. I'm just nervous, just hearing the story. Like, because it seems like you just got in there in pockets of safe time before, like, and got out right before, war broke out, it
yeah,
seems like. So it's really amazing that you got to be there, like, just in the nick of time. And so then when did you, I mean, I know that you had said on our other call that you didn't expect to stay in Iraq as
yeah,
long as you did.
yeah.
So what caused you to stay so much longer?
Well, it was funny because I got there and I thought, okay, I'll just, find a teacher on day one and start studying. I was very
Yeah.
focused at that time. And what I discovered as I got there and was like, first of all, at the airport, there were three sets of cousins, like three different families, all saying, no, come home with us, come home with us. Sort of, okay, so I ended up getting in the car with one cousin, and then the next day it was like a big lunch, and then a dinner, and then another cousin is inviting me to their place, and so just getting through all the houses and dinners and lunches and meeting, sort of, because I didn't grow up with this family. I mean, I'd only been to Iraq once as a teenager, so I was meeting people for the first time, and
Oh,
suddenly like, oh, I'm part of this family. Like it wasn't like okay, getting to know each other and stuff, but I was like automatically part of this family,
wow.
uh, even though I was connected to, and they just accepted me and took me in. Um, so I was there about 2 or 3 weeks before I even could start thinking about studying music.
Wow.
And then it just happened that one of my cousins had a place across in the same mall as a musician who was the son-in-law of the scholar, like the main authority on Iraqi maqam. He had married the daughter of this great scholar. So it was like I went to him one day with the trumpet, and he says, "Oh, okay, you can try to play Iraqi maqam on trumpet. Why not? It's not traditional at all, but he was open to it."
Uh-huh.
And then after like a week, he said, "You want me to introduce you to this guy?" And I thought, "Well, Jesus, I mean, I don't have any business talking to this guy. I barely spoke Arabic, much less to even know what question to ask." But I met this Haji Hashim Rajab was his name, and I went to his house and actually played for him and got some really good feedback a few times. But he was in his 80s, and shortly after the war, he passed away, not as a direct result, but he was his old age. So
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Wow. And so when did you leave the Middle East after this, like, kind of tour
yeah.
that you did?
Well, I stayed in Iraq to the end of '02, and then I was in 2003. Basically, from 2003 through 2006, kind of around, sometimes spending time in Cairo, Amman, Jordan. I'd been to Aleppo just once in Syria for a few months, and just finding teachers wherever I could. But I was also, a lot of the Iraqi musicians and the experts of this tradition were living in Europe. So most of my research was in London, where my main teacher, his name is Hamid El-Saadi. Um, I was taking lessons with him almost every day for many months on end. And then another teacher in Munich who was the son of that authority that I mentioned earlier. His name is Bach.
Oh,
And I would, I'd stay with the family, live in their house, and sort of be. It was like being in Iraq, but outside of Iraq, sort of. And this was during, 2004, 5, 6. So it was a really, the sectarian strife in Iraq was at its height, and the instability and violence was, we were watching the news together, sort of experiencing it from afar, but also being connected throughout. So, um, and then another teacher was in the Netherlands. Her name is Farida. She's a very, very famous maqam singer. And her whole family, her husband and another family that they work with, play all the different instruments. So I got good training from them as well.
okay. So you spent a good amount of time in Europe,
It
but
was,
studying.
yeah, it was about 5 years, kind of mostly between the Middle East and Europe.
Wow. Okay. And so you told me that at least when you described the teaching with I mean, studying with the teacher in the UK, that it was really a lot like an apprentice style. Would you say it was apprentice style
Hmm.
like the whole time?
Yeah, yeah. Very quickly, he sort of took me in as more of an apprentice than a student, in the
Uh-huh.
sense that, um, like my first lesson with him wasn't just come in and he was a singer, so we all of our lessons were through the voice. But the first lesson, it was like talking for an hour, getting to know each other, and then having sort of really direct, because it's not written, so it's like everything has to be sung back and forth, which means that the relationship with the teacher, he's almost giving you something every time, like
Oh.
it's the way of transmission, because when you're looking the person in the eye, you're sort of feeling the sound come from them, as opposed to both of us looking at a piece of paper that's
Yeah.
out of ourselves, and sort of, so it's intense.
It sounds like it. Okay, that didn't even occur to me to ask you that, and it's so ridiculous that I didn't. So it's not written down at all.
Yeah, right. It's not written down. I mean, there's some shorthand, but you couldn't learn from a written score, so it has to be taught by ear.
Okay.
Um, and I actually had never quite thought of it that way either. But in that, because in that mode of learning, you're always getting it directly from the source, from
Oh,
a person who's learned it, who's lived in it, who's it's I mean, it's different. It's a different feeling.
it's
But
so different.
yeah,
I mean, I'm just thinking about the difference between learning the way we learn compared
yeah,
to that is it's so much more emotional, don't you
yeah,
think?
yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, so can you describe what that's like a little bit more? So every time you're sitting there, you're like, it's almost like I don't know, I don't even know. Can you describe that a little bit more? How you would describe what it's like to take a lesson and sit there and sing back and forth with people, considering that like growing up as a trumpet player, you probably had traditional lessons like everyone has. You know, you just sit
Yeah.
in a chair, you're looking at this music and it's pointing at the paper and it's copying what you see on the paper. So what does that do for you in that learning experience where you're learning directly like you said like they're giving it to you? What's that like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very different um, dynamic, and I think first of all, there's no instrument too because we're just singing, so that you can't like hide behind this piece of metal that you
Yeah.
stick in your face. So I recall one lesson. My teacher it was during Ramadan, and so he was fasting, and I decided to fast as well. Um, and I'm not used to it because I don't always fast. I've done it a few times, but. And I remember this one day, it was like, at the end of the period of, so, not having eaten for more than 12 hours. And he kept repeating this one phrase. And, it's really, really intense because he's like looking me directly in the eye and saying, and at some point I just like burst out laughing because I think I couldn't handle the intensity of it. And he was just sort of confused, like, what's so funny? And there was something that triggered it. I don't even remember a way he pronounced a word that reminded me. But I just sort of lost it. And I always look back at that event because it was sort of ridiculous and embarrassing to, he's a very sort of uh, strong and solid man, for me to be. But he started laughing too, and it kind of broke the ice in a way. We spent about half an hour, like every time I'd open my mouth to start singing, I'd start laughing, or he'd start, But I think, I realize now that probably it was just like, whoa, this is really, there's nothing to hide behind. I mean, there's no, it's very, very direct. And I mean, I wasn't necessarily conscious of it at the time, but looking back, I think there's sort of it's like the person is singing and their voice is resonating and there's a vibration that then enters you in the process. So then when you repeat, you're also emulating um, that resonance or that vibration. So it there's some kind of continuity, kind of like candle being just one flame. Sort of you could light endless candles that way. Um, Through transmission. So it's something like that. It's really
That's cool. So,
yeah.
how do you think that all of that singing has impacted your trumpet playing? Learning in that way for such a long time.
Yeah, it's really changed my trumpet playing because for one thing, when we sing, oftentimes we don't think of notes in the same way. Like on the trumpet, everything has a fingering and everything has a lip and air intensity and
Yeah.
air. So, and you're always thinking, you're conscious of what note you're playing. But in singing, it's easy to sort of just follow the melody. I mean, usually when we sing folk songs or pop songs or something we heard on the radio, we're not thinking what the notes are. But when we play on the instrument, we kind of have to.
Yeah.
So it sort of opened me to hearing in an intuitive way, pre-classification of what each note name is, and also opened me to hearing a lot of the ornamentation and the subtle shifting that goes on, and also the shifting of overtones, like when you open your mouth in different ways, different frequencies are accentuated. So I was able to start to control that more and more. And I didn't really play much trumpet during my period of researching. I was singing and playing another instrument called santur, which is a hammered dulcimer,
Uh-huh.
rock. And so through the process of both, when I reemerged on the trumpet, it's funny, I lost certain things that I don't know if I'll ever get back. Certain classical technique that was like a particularly crisp attack and a way of making sound, which I don't think is necessary, but I did lose. I stopped practicing in that way, but really trying to like play the horn like I'm singing, which I guess we're always trying to do. But
Yeah, that's what
having,
everyone says they want to do. But like
yeah,
you took it to the next level by not playing and singing for 5 years, which is
yeah,
it's really cool.
it's still a tricky. It's a very to kind of there's still a lot to learn because singing comes so naturally. I mean, especially once you learn something well enough, it starts to feel like speaking, and then picking up the instrument and having to sort of translate that with all the mechanism of the valves and technique and all that. But it's and there's some kind of unlearning of habits that I formed from playing in orchestras that I don't need for this music. So that's
Yeah.
interesting.
So I have
Yeah.
two questions about this. I'm thinking of, and I'm like, I can't forget them. Like, don't forget it, don't forget it. 'Cause, one of them is, do you have a sense of responsibility now? Like, if this isn't, if this is this big tradition and it's really hard to, you really had to go on a journey to find the people to teach it to you, and now you know it. What is your what are you going to do with that? I know what you're doing, a little bit about what you're doing in the way of making it your own and combining it with jazz and things like that. But now you're probably one of the very few people on the planet who knows the entire tradition. So what's that like knowing that you know something
Uh,
like that?
yeah, yeah. There's level. Well, for one thing, I'm not the only person. So there's one person who knows the entire tradition, and that's my teacher.
Okay.
Um, and I know because I really spent time following up and learning who's doing what, and he's the only one who knows at least the Baghdadi tradition, because
Okay.
every city has its own approach. And then there are other musicians that perform bits and pieces of the repertoire, and some that do quite a bit of it, but no nobody is comprehensive. But they have a very these other singers authentic and connect, very rooted in this music, and it's very clear when they play. I had to really, really work and sort of study the fine, like certain things came intuitively and other things not. But I learned to perform this music to the point that, Iraq. I have a traditional Iraqi band, and we'd play in Iraqi parties, and people would assume that I had just come from Iraq because apparently, I wasn't singing with any detectable accent, and the phrasing was authentic and stuff. So that was something really special to reach. And I guess today, when I think about responsibility, there's two ways that it works. One is to preserve and sort of keep this musical language and tradition alive.
Yeah.
And there are periods of time where I'm really focused on that, and periods where I'm getting further away from it. But that's one aspect, and so that's actually why I'm going to bring my teacher Hamid to the U.S. To do some teaching and performing. He'll actually be at Duke in October, um, which is not too far from you.
No, it's very close.
Yeah, but the other side of it, and this is the sort of more nuanced part, is where it's preservation through preservation through innovation, if that makes sense. In the sense that I'm bringing these melodies and this tuning system and this whole modal approach into contact with jazz and contemporary classical music so that it can interact with these newer waves of musical sound and ways of making music so that we can now it can become integrated and be part of the the conversation. So in that sense, I don't, like I used to feel a bit torn, like, okay, if I'm going to do my own thing with this music, am I losing, am I no longer being faithful to this
Yeah.
tradition? And in fact, doing my own thing with it is being faithful to the tradition because all traditions are in a state of evolution and change. And so at any moment, it's necessary to find what's the next what's the next um, way that, how does music make sense today at this moment? Um, so yeah,
That's
it's
amazing. So describe what that was like when you came home and you started to work on your process now that you had this new knowledge.
yeah. I had time. So I received a commission, and that was in 2006 to compose a piece combining jazz and Iraqi maqam. And it was really challenging at that time because I had gotten very deep into Iraqi maqam and didn't really see how or really why there wasn't a need to combine it with anything because it was pure
Hmm.
and beautiful as it was. But as I started to meditate on this a little bit more, different connections began to emerge between different aspects of jazz tradition and Iraqi music, and I started to kind of put together different elements of each. It was a very intentional process at the beginning, in that I had to like think, okay, this part of jazz and this Iraqi maqam melody, there was kind of all pre-existing elements that I was now recombining.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that's how the process began. And over the next few years, it kind of loosened up, and all of those it became more intuitive. And now, like I often don't know if I'm drawing on this tradition or that. I'm just playing music or writing music.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So
That's
there's sort
great.
of inspiration. Yeah.
It's so and right. That's I just love the description of the evolution and how your own compositional style evolved as you continued, which is so amazing.
Mhm.
So, so what are so describe what it you just described. You actually told us at the beginning that you're working on Bach cello suites.
Yeah.
Are you incorporating some of the Makam in the Bach cello suites, or is that just totally a separate?
Well, it's interesting because there's a couple levels to it. For one, anybody who's spent time playing modal music, let's say Middle Eastern or even Greek or Eastern European music, when you come back to Bach, suddenly you can almost hear these melodies in the context of maqam. It's really kind of eerie. I never thought of Bach outside of the context of harmony and Western equal temperament, but really the so many of the melodies are you could just change the ornamentation and it would be like Egyptian or Arabic. It's
Wow.
not the arpeggiated ones, like for instance, not the first G major cello suite, which I won't attempt to sing right now, but I think a lot of people might be able to hear it in their head. That kind of those are more based on chords and arpeggios, which aren't native to Middle Eastern music. But when you have this sort of stepwise motion, I mean, those melodies are really that's where it becomes very interesting because there's something inherent about the collection of pitches and the sequence and the contour that is seems to exist in many musical traditions. And so I wonder then, okay, yeah, Bach was of course creating, but he's also sort of drawing on his knowledge and what was what melodies and what was being played um, at that time in his world. So it's just a lot of times the difference between one musical tradition and another comes down to language, like spoken language if it's sung, and then of course how the spoken language affects ornaments, and the ornaments and the gestures that are related again to speech. So if you look at the just the essence of the melody, it's not very different. It's just that if you play it with a particular trill, it sounds like Baroque. If you slide between the notes, it would sound like raga. If, you know, it's often in the ornaments
Wow.
uh, that the difference occurs.
That's
So
so cool. So it's just based on the point of view that you've now acquired from your journey.
yeah,
Essentially, essentially like a journey to discover yourself through music.
yeah, yeah. It's sort of it's a very personal. It's like discovering myself, and then hopefully to discover a larger musical, you know, something universal in the music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And through it, it seems to me like you really discovered your musical purpose, you know? Like it was a
Yeah. That's
discovery process.
yeah, and it's still an unfolding process,
Uh-huh.
changing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that too because so often, I mean, personally, as someone who studied only classical music, I feel like there was always just this idea that you would figure it all out and then you'd be ready to go, like instead
Yeah.
of considering that it's always evolving and changing and growing and moving in a direction that's
Yeah.
just going forward. Yeah. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that whole idea.
Even composers and improvisers can get into the mold of, okay, that's how it is, and I found it, and then just sort of stay with that for a long time. It's not necessarily that people who are creating music, people get into creative ruts or not just
Okay.
ruts, repetition, let's say. A
Yeah.
lot find what works and then stick with that for a long time. But in general, the composers and the musicians that I've always been drawn to, whether it's Miles Davis or Bartok or Beethoven, are people where you can trace an evolution in their process and that of reconsidering of what they know and who they are musically.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
really beautiful. So tell me, what's going on next for you?
Well, at present, I'm preparing for a tour with my Rivers of Sound Orchestra, and that's a 17-piece group that is an outgrowth of my six-piece Two Rivers ensemble. So, Two Rivers has been together since 2006. That's the first piece I told you about earlier.
Yeah.
And then that group has, continued to evolve, and then this latest iteration started in 2015. And so it's the six-piece Two Rivers ensemble plus 11 other musicians, generally playing, uh, jazz, um, Western instrumentation, as well as Arabic, Middle Eastern instruments.
So you started the ensemble after you started
Yeah,
composing? Okay.
yeah, I got some. I had to apply for some funding to put it together, but it was something that I really felt compelled and motivated to do, and it's a big production, and I'm basically handling. I mean, I have some help with some assistance, but I'm basically in charge of this group and making sure everyone's available for the gigs and learning the music. And if there's a sub, then I go and rehearse. It's a lot to manage. Never mind 1099s and all the tax part. I mean, it's like I'm sort of the orchestra manager. I'm not a particularly good manager and that part doesn't come intuitively. That composing and rehearsing and performing, I love it, and I wish I could just do that all day. But part of being on the sort of entrepreneurial side of leading one's own groups and stuff means having today, at least in today's music world, means having to deal with a lot of the logistics and administrative parts
Yeah.
as well. Yeah,
Yeah, that's the stuff we don't necessarily always think about, but it's there. It's the reality of it. So thanks for
yeah.
sharing that part. That's really important to keep in mind. So,
Yeah,
and
just a little caveat for anyone
yeah,
who's
exactly. And you have a concert coming up, right? That
so
you're,
yeah. So
yeah.
Rivers of Sound, yeah, we're playing Iowa City at the Hansher Auditorium on February 8th, and then February 9th is a very special concert for me because we're going to be at Symphony Center or Orchestra Hall in Chicago, which is where the Chicago Symphony Orchestra plays and where I used to go regularly for civic rehearsals, and I think
Yeah.
you were quite a bit as well back in
Yes.
Chicago days. Um, and then the following night, February 10th, we'll be in New York City at the Skirball, which is at NYU campus.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I will make sure the links to how you can go to those concerts are in the show notes.
Oh,
So,
wonderful.
yeah, I'll put this episode out right before that so people can go. Because I mean, I tell you, if I was in one of those cities, I would definitely be there. It sounds fantastic.
Well, I hope you'll get to attend one of our shows
Yeah,
soon.
when you're here, when you're bringing your teacher to the U.S., are you coming with to Duke?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Okay,
I'll
we'll have to get together then for sure.
certainly, yeah.
That's
I-
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amir. This was a great interview. I'm so happy that you had the time to in
oh,
between touring and everything that you do to come on the show. It's really great.
it's my pleasure. Thank you,
Thanks so
Tracy. It's
much.
good to reconnect with you in this way. So,
So great. Thank you so much.
yeah. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.